On this channel, we learn how to draw people. We do figure drawing, we do portraits. We think about how to build up the forms of the figure and face. But what we don't often do is put those people in a place and draw that place, draw that environment. And there's a number of additional challenges. And actually the approach that we take to drawing the people can change a lot depending on what we're trying to achieve with the broader picture. So that is what we're going to look at today. So here I've got two paintings I did of my local neighborhood, and there are figures in both of these scenes, right? And the role that these figures are playing in these scenes, in these paintings, is quite different. And so the approach that I'm going to take is quite different. And in the first one, it is a street where the sun is going down. And what is the painting about? That's the first thing I've got to ask myself. If I'm just doing a portrait, it's about the face. It's about the wonderful forms and the way that the planes turn on the face usually. And sometimes that also is about the light, you know, the way the light is hitting the face and creating shadows on the face and things like that. In this scene though, it's not so much about any individual person. It's about the light and how the light is going down, coming in on this diagonal, right? You know, those lovely summer evenings where the sun seems to, you know, really cast long shadows. And so this street is getting this long shadow from the other side of the street across it. And then in terms of the composition, we're hoping that the viewer's eyes are going to come down here through this shape of light, right? Because broadly speaking, there's a simple sort of lit side of this painting and then a shadow part, right? And it kind of comes down here, and then we get these people, and they're a kind of secondary point of interest that continue to guide us. And then maybe we end up here, there's a little light right here. And so the idea is that the composition of the picture, this is my idea anyway, what I hoped for was that it would bring the viewer's eye into this moment, and it would be about the light, about the atmosphere, and it would kind of have the viewer's eye guided through and wondering about this street and feeling that moment. It's not about this person or this person or this person or this person. So then what role are they playing then, right? Their role, there's a couple of roles that they're playing. Number one is they are kind of breaking up the simple big shadow shape with some interesting smaller shapes, because it's nice to have really big shapes, big ideas, and then a few smaller ideas. They're also playing a sort of role explaining the scale. So sometimes if you just have a place with no people, we know what size roughly people are. So when you put, by the way, if I'm sweating, I am excited about this topic, but it's not because I'm getting like too passionate about this. It's absolutely boiling here. All right, but we don't often know the scale. We don't feel the scale until there's something there that we instantly know how big that is, and then we know how big everything else is. So if we want this building to feel tall, we can put in some figures, and that helps us feel the scale. It's also the case that anytime we see people, they have a sort of large compositional weight. They're kind of dense, like the gravity coming off a figure is much greater than for other stuff that we're less, you know, we care less about. It's especially the case if you have like a face with eyes in it. You're going to sort of immediately, it's going to have so much power visually, when immediately these eyes are going to be attracting our attention very, very much. And so anytime we see a person, then they're going to have this large compositional weighting. And so some big shape, like a big lit part of a building, could be outweighed by, you know, the idea of a person. But this picture wasn't about the people. And so the way that I tried to handle this then, to kind of have them there and give them some strength in the composition, but not too much so that it's all about them, because it's really about the moment and the mood, is number one, you can see they don't really have a ton of definition. They're really simple. So whereas in the figure drawings and stuff that we do, where it's all about the figure, we're going to really try to explain the forms of the figure, right? And even then, we're going to downplay some areas of the figure and really bring more attention to other areas of the figure. But we're going to make it about the turning of the form and how that looks and how that works. Or we're going to make it about the gesture and things like that. But in this case, we're kind of simplifying them. They're a little bit flat, right? They're a little bit flat. These two are given a little bit more prominence. And so there's a little bit more form given to them, right? Like this lower leg. The way that I'm thinking about the underlying figure is the same, right? I'm thinking about simple head. I'm thinking about torso, cylindrical shapes in the legs and things like that. But I'm not trying to wrap lots of lines and shadow shapes and stuff around those forms and really create that sense of form. I'm not trying to give these people tons of form like I would, let's say, if I was doing a figure painting. So I have censored this because YouTube's getting a bit more sensitive about figure drawing. But anyway, what this painting is about is, trying to turn these forms of the figure. So it's about the light coming across the figure and then hitting these planes differently and creating interesting shapes. And in some places, I kind of keep it more flat so that the more form, like kind of explaining the forms more clearly, showing the forms more in a couple of areas. I don't want to do that all over the picture because those areas really attract a lot of attention. And if it's about everything, it's kind of about nothing. So even here, I'm not explaining all the forms as much as I possibly can. And so in here, there's a whole scene to factor in. So I'm definitely not going to really try to sculpt out all the details of these figures, right? And then these further away figures over here, they're even more flat, right? It's almost like they're kind of cardboard cutouts. So because it's not, I don't want to, if I start kind of putting in a bunch of really clearly defined sort of 3D forms all over the place, like let's say back here, I see, a sort of cylindrical shape and stuff like that. And obviously I'm using a big green pen, so it really stands out. But even if I did this, properly with the right colors of paint and things, if I really start to try and describe this and render it in detail, first of all, this kind of really three-dimensional feeling thing is going to come forward in the composition, and I want to push it back, right? A part of creating a scene is creating the depth. This area is further away, so you can see like a lot of the edges are getting more softened. A lot of the contrast is reduced. So like closer stuff, I'll have more deep darks and a little bit more light to dark transitions. Back here, things are I'm trying to make them kind of disappear a little bit, but I'm also not trying to define a bunch of three-dimensional ideas. So all the stuff that we're trying to do in our figure drawing and portraiture, where we're trying to create that illusion of three-dimensionality, sculpting out the forms, I'm not going to do so much with lots of individual things, especially that are not as important to the picture or that are further away. So like into the big kind of simple type of depth that I want to create is just the depth of the street scene. So, these buildings are kind of like boxes, basically, and there's these kind of awnings and things like that. And I just want to get the fact that there's this depth being created. But I don't want a ton of dimensionality to these figures who are really quite secondary to the picture. Now, because these two are given a little bit of extra prominence, I do have a little bit of light on the top planes of them, which does give them that little bit of extra dimensionality. So what if we contrast that approach to the figures with the approach in here? Right? And so in some ways in here, I've got two different approaches to the figures. I've got the figures of the orchestra, right? And then I've got the figures of the family that's watching the orchestra. And so what is this picture really about? This picture is about this moment that I saw in the park, right? And trying to record it because it's a really lovely moment. there's light coming in, there's a huge shadow from the tree, there's an orchestra, there's a ton of stuff going on, there's a sort of bandstand, there's a bunch of trees in the background. So if we work right from the back, I'm trying to fuzz things away, kind of have them melt away. Some of these edges are too sharp, my watercolor technique isn't yet at the level that I want it to be, but I want stuff that's further away to have less contrast. There's a little bit of color variation and things like that, but I don't want like big serious sense of, because if you really look at this scene, if you were there and you looked at the tree, it would be like much more sort of severe changes, right, with the lit part of the tree and the dark part of the tree. And I could really create the lit side and the shadow side and do all the stuff that I would do in a figure drawing on that tree, because I'm looking at the tree and I'm trying to capture the tree. But if I start to do that, right, I'm going to have this tree really coming forward in the composition and actually kind of flattening it. Now, something that I don't sort of really hear talked about that much, but which to me kind of explains why this is so important and why this is so difficult, is like, if I just look at my hand in front of my face and I focus on it, everything out there behind my hand is fuzzed away. It's like blurry, but then if I start to look at that stuff further away, it gets much crisper and clearer, right? Because I'm focusing on different things. So in a painting, if I start to focus on the tree in the background, it's going to become really crispy and clear to me. And then I'm going to sort of paint it in this really clear, crispy way with lots of form and details. And then I come and look at the people here in the foreground, and it will be the same. And I'll kind of treat everything the same, and then suddenly it looks really flat. But in reality, if we are looking at these people watching this orchestra, then basically we're going to kind of have quite a bit of information about them and their forms and kind of clarity about them. And then everything behind them is going to start to get more blurry. But the problem is that when I look at the stuff behind, or if I've taken a photo and the camera is like able to sort of capture, like my phone camera like captures everything really crisply and gives everything a lot of contrast and clarity. And if I just paint it like that, I've got to sort of force myself basically to be seeing lots of detail and clarity in the trees back here, but then removing all of that and sort of blurring it down and pushing it back in the composition, right? And so this orchestra, these are a bunch of people, but they are secondary sort of characters in the story. And the reason that this was such a good scene to paint is because they happened to, well, I guess they set up there because it's too hot to be playing for hours and hours in the sun, but they'd set up in the shadow. And that meant that their values all got merged. They're all relatively kind of dark. It also meant that the blue of the sky is lighting them rather than the warm sunlight. So they kind of got bluer and darker, and that's what creates this, right? And so I did put in some darks, not so much to define them, but more just to break up this big shape of blue a little bit. And because they are more forward, like originally I had these guys without these deeper darks, just a kind of sort of blue thing. I showed it to my painting teacher Jared, and he's like, they're basically treated very similarly to what's back here, but we do want that sense of here's the foreground, here's the middle ground, and here's the background. And so we want to kind of, in this case, in this particular case, because it's about these foreground characters, we're going to provide the most clarity and sort of form, clarity of form. Here's the side of the head, here it turns, all this kind of stuff. We're going to provide this extra clarity for them. We're going to have almost none of it back here. But here, we want this to be in front of this. So we're going to have a little bit more to it in terms of the value. And so I added these deeper darks in to give them a little bit more contrast, a little bit more information. And so we have like a really clear hierarchy, hopefully, where we kind of come into the picture, we see these people first, right? Hopefully they stand out, they're lit their shape of light is in front of this shape of dark. So there's a good amount of contrast. They're three-dimensional. They have a sort of shadow side and a lit side. There's form to them. Not quite the amount of form that I would use in a figure painting or a portrait, because, you know, it's still about the whole scene. It's not really just about them. But I'm giving them this additional information so that they come forward in the scene. And then, you know, they're looking and we'll follow their gaze and we'll go into this orchestra, right? And then maybe we'll kind of go around the rest of the sort of moment that's happening here with the bandstand and other stuff that's happening. But I think we're going to kind of travel through this picture and look, you know, I don't know, sort of meander through this moment. But there's hopefully a clear hierarchy where these people are brought forward, these are in the middle, and this is pushed to the back. And so the question is, when you're doing a figure in a scene, is what role are these figures playing? In the previous one, it's to make the street feel populated, right? It's to make it feel like it's a sort of buzzing environment and to give scale. Whereas in this one, it's actually about these people's experience. You know, she's kind of kneeling down to sort of share the experience with her kid. And then it's about what that experience is secondarily, which is the wonderful orchestra moment. So what role are your figures playing? Okay, so this to me is the most crucial point about figures in a scene. It basically, depending on the role that the figures are playing, you're going to dial up how much form and clarity you give the figures, or dial them down if they're playing a different role, right? So a painting I did quite a while ago now, but hopefully it illustrates the point, when we were on holiday in France, is this one. And I've got figures in here. And, you know, in terms of sort of composition, they're there to as small shapes to balance out these big shapes. It's nice to have big, medium, small size shapes, but also to provide scale, right? If these people weren't here, I don't think this thing would feel as big as it does, because this thing is really big, you know, and it feels big because these people look quite small. And I haven't given them tons of form, right? If we zoom into this figure, you know, I'm not using all the stuff that I normally use in a figure drawing, right? It's kind of a flat shape, but there is a top plane, so there's a tiny bit of information to it. There's these kind of white bits to show there's light falling onto the top of them. But other than that, they're just kind of like a red thing, you know, with a tapering sort of structure. And when it comes to the information that I'm trying to give about these figures, which we've really zoomed in on here, I'm basically trying to say that they're a head on top of a sort of triangle, you know, so there's a sort of egg-shaped head. And then broadly speaking, the body goes narrower from the shoulders down to the ankles. And it's a bit like when I say to you in other videos about figure drawing, like, yes, in the arm, there's the bicep and the tricep and the brachioradialis. But most importantly, it just starts off wider and it gets narrower. So how about we just capture that first? Well, how about the whole figure, when you're looking at a figure, starts off a bit wider at the shoulders and then tends towards narrowness down at the ankles, but with a head on the top, you know? So that is like, it's like hierarchies of information that we're trying to capture. In here, we're trying to capture the bare minimum information because they're playing a very secondary role in the picture. Whereas if it was a figure drawing or a portrait, of, like I've said a million times, so I'll stop repeating myself. But then we would describe the forms more fully because that's what the picture's about. So the next question is, how do I make sure these figures relate to each other and the scene properly so they feel like they're in the scene and not just kind of stuck onto it or something? One thing to do is to make sure the perspective is working. All right, so if we have an eye level like this, all right. Now, if you're not sure what I mean about the eye level, it's the level of the eyes of the person looking at the scene, in this case, me. I'm standing. I'm probably a similar height to these people, right? And so my eye level is the same as their eye level. And you'll notice that for all these people standing, some of them are standing further away, so they're short, the sort of length of their body is shorter. Some are closer, so that the length is longer. And if we had someone really far away, the length of their body might be even shorter still. And if we had someone here, the length of their body from my perspective would go even longer. But their eye level, if they're standing and they're roughly the same height as me, is going to be all along this line. So if you're not sure how that works, I've got a really good video about this linked below. Now also, all of these lines that are parallel to the ground are going to be going to a vanishing point somewhere over here or something. Right? Somewhere like this. My lines are wonky, so it won't be exactly there, but they're all going to be going to roughly the same place. And what I can do then is I can think of another line from that point that basically corresponds to the people's feet. So if someone is walking along this pavement here, let's say this guy keeps walking down over here, well, his eye level is going to stay the same. It's going to stay on that horizon line, on that eye level line here. It's always going to be the same because his eyes are at the same level as my eyes. And so everything that's at the level of my eyes in this scene as I'm looking at it is going to stay at my eye level no matter how far away it goes. But his feet are not at my eye level, right? And so they are going to run along this line that goes towards that vanishing point, and that's why he sort of appears sort of shorter and shorter, right, as he goes away from me. So if you're not sure about this principle, then check out this video I'm on about that I'm linking below. So what I've explained so far is, what if, basically imagine people kind of on this line and how their height changes in the picture as they go away from us. But what if they are not on that line, all right? So let's say this is the height of this guy here. But what if he was standing over here, right? So if he just moves sideways, like laterally, he's going to be the same, right? He's going to be the same. His feet will be at the same level and his eye level will be at the same level. He's just moved across the picture, not deeper into the picture kind of thing. But what if I want to go, all right, I want to have this guy, this height, but I want to place him like over here, like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my line for the feet towards that vanishing point. I'll then figure out his height as if he was standing on this line. And then I can carry that across to here. And then I can say, so that's how tall he would be. So it's almost like I sort of establish a wall of guys this height walking along this line, and then I can carry that across as I see fit. What if he was shorter? What if he was a child and so he's much shorter? Well, I go, all right, let's say he's a child who's like up to the guy's elbow walking next to him. So I want to put a child over here now. So what I do is I go, well, if it was a guy this height, he'd be this tall over here. And then I'd think roughly where his elbow would be, and then I'd know how tall that child should be, right? So it kind of, once I've got a figure figured out, this guy, I can then extrapolate from there and get all kinds of people. Taller, shorter, how about a dog? This dog is like knee height, so therefore where is the height of this guy's knee if he was this far into the picture, that kind of thing. So I want to think about the perspective to make sure that works. So just to see that as another example. So in this picture from France, I was thinking, all right, so this is like my eye level. So even when I was doing the shops, I was kind of making sure, like, if I was walking into this shop, I don't want my head to be hitting the awning. I also don't want the awning thingy to be a million miles high. It's just a bit higher than my head. So I want to kind of place that awning relative to the eye line in a way that makes sense if I was walking into that shop. But also all these people here, and this is assuming that the ground is reasonably flat, like we're not on a hill, but all these people, their eye level should be kind of roughly similar to my eye level, but how far down their feet go depends on how close they are to me. So if they're further away, they're obviously going to appear smaller. If they're closer, they're going to start to appear bigger, but their eye level will be the same as mine because they're standing up and they're a similar height to me. The next thing that I want to do is try to merge their values with the values of the scene in a good way. So one thing is just to use cast shadows. So have cast shadows coming off the figure in a way that travels along the ground plane and then matches other stuff in the scene, which is casting shadows. So like the angle of it's the same and it's falling across the ground in the same way. So I can just, if the figures are there in the scene, I can just look. All these things like the eye level and how big the people could be, we could get these right by just really observing, like by measuring them and making, if we have a photo. But if we're drawing this from real life and they're actually moving, we can't just measure them anymore, right? It's a moment in time. And so that's why some of these principles about perspective and stuff could be useful. And so we want to understand what angle is the light coming in from, where is the ground, and how is the light going to cast a shadow from the figure across that ground. Now in this picture here, they're not really casting much of a shadow. The street was quite a smooth surface, and so I kind of put in a little bit of sort of semi-reflection from these people, because there was a little bit of reflection because the street is quite a sort of relatively smooth surface, and it also just made it more interesting, right? And so I tried to put that in, but I also tried to make sure their values were similar between the figure and the scene, especially for the figures where I don't want them to stand out from the scene too much. I want them to kind of be part of it, especially these further away ones. These two are a little bit more prominent in the scene, so they get a little bit more value contrast, right? They get a darker dark. Now this whole shadow area is in the dark, right? It's not even close to the amount of contrast I've got between the lit and the dark area. But within the dark area, there are differing levels of contrast, and these two get a little bit more. It feels like a lot when we zoom in, like there's a really dark against a light background. But when we zoom out, they're not standing out too much because the contrast between the light and the dark is the big, prominent value change that's happening. So with this scene, which is slightly different, that is the approach I take for the orchestra because they're secondary. So their values are much more closely merged in to the shadow around them, so that as a shape, they just become one big shape. It's a little bit broken up by a few dark points. Whereas for these characters here, the value change is much stronger, right? I've got them kind of lit shapes on them placed against dark shapes of the tree shadow. So this is a much stronger contrast, and therefore they're getting a much more visual prominence, and that corresponds to the role that I gave them earlier on, right? So we talked about the role, figuring out how much form to give people, placing them in perspective, dealing with the values that corresponds to their role and how much prominence to give them, and also to create cast shadows and things that merge with the scene around. One last thing that we want to think about is overlaps. If you just kind of have a scene where you've got like a person and a person, and a person and a person, they'll just kind of look like they're floating in space. If I can make sure that this person is in front of this shadow scene, like this bit of shadow, and ideally we've got this person being in front of this person, and then we've got this person being in front of this lit thing behind, and I've got overlaps. This is good. Even if I come into this other scene down here, I've got people in front of people and things. So I've got this person in front of this person in front of this shop. This person is in front of this person, in front of this person, which is in front of this thing. The more I can overlap things, the more they feel like they're in the same place, and the more depth that I can create into the scene. You know, I want to have this in front of this, all of this kind of stuff. What's in front of what to give a sort of depth hierarchy here. If I go around on a different angle, when I chose the scene, I might end up with like, okay, I've got my scene and there's a person here and then there's a thing here, right? And then there's a tree and then there's a thing and then there's a person. Well, if I just move the camera around, now suddenly I've got a person in front of a thing, with a tree behind and then another person over here. And now this is going to help me to create that depth and make them feel like they're in the same place rather than just being like isolated objects floating in space kind of thing. So we've got overlaps, we've got values, and either adding contrast to the values or reducing it to push people back or bring them forward, or to, reduce their prominence in the composition or bring it up. Then we've got the different role that the figures are going to play in the scene, and with and then these kind of perspective ideas to make sure that they're all relating in perspective. And with that bag of tricks, you should be able to put figures into a scene. So I'll put the video about the eye level thing up on the screen. You can check it out if you want. I'll put another one up on the screen about just drawing figures and the simple forms. I hope this was helpful. Doing scenes with people in them is so much fun. It brings a story and a bit of narrative to what's going on. So, all right, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.